Hello everybody, welcome to a set of lectures on AI and data ethics, lecture 1. I'm Paula Boddington. This is a set of lectures that I gave at the New College of Humanities in the autumn term 2020, which I thought I might as well upload onto YouTube. And this is the introduction to the first lecture. So who am I? Here's a bit of boring biographical detail stuff about me, about some of the degrees I've done and where I've taught. But I've been working for the last 5 or 6 years or so on ethical issues in relation to AI. My main background is in philosophy, but I've also done a lot of work working with other people from different disciplines like sociologists and research scientists and computer scientists. On the left here, you can see a book that I wrote in 2017 called Towards a Code of Ethics for Artificial Intelligence. So this book came out of a research project that I was working on, where I was looking at how we might regulate ethical issues in AI. This came up from a Google search that I did when I was doing some background work for this lecture, and there's a few books also written on the same area that you might be interested in. Robot Ethics, AI Ethics by Mark Kotelberg, Nick Bostrom's Superintelligence, and so on, The Ethical Algorithm, which I'll be talking about in future lectures, and Moral Machines by Wendell Wallach, which I'll also mention, possibly. This Google search illustrates something really interesting as well, slightly interesting, because of course when I did the search I was delighted that my book came up first, even though I'm absolutely certain that Nick Bostrom's book on superintelligence has sold far more copies than my book. Of course, the reason why it came up first almost certainly is because Google knew it was me who was searching. So one of the things this illustrates is how the information that we get online is made personal to us, and also shows. It made me realise there's one little moral thing that comes along with this. There's a terrible danger of narcissism. I was kind of laughing with glee that my book came up first, even though I'm sure the others have sold more than mine. But it just helped to illustrate one of the things that we need to think about in this course, how the AI that we're using around us, and thinking of AI actually very broadly in terms of the computing power we use around us, is shaping the very world that we see. A little while ago, I was asked to recommend top 5 books in ethics for artificial intelligence. I always hate selecting the best of this and the best of that, because there are so many interesting books around in this area. But I just wanted to use this at the start of this lecture just to illustrate some ways in which I think it's useful to think about our work in AI. So I've selected 5 books which I try to make as different as possible. So the first book, number 1, is by John Havens, Artificial Intelligence, and I've selected it because he's a really interesting person actually. He's got a background in theatre and in literature as well as in technology, and he's currently reading the IEEE, the Institute for Electronic Electrical, it's so hard to say, the Institute for Electrical and Electronic Engineers has for a few years had a big project looking at ethical issues in autonomous systems, and he's leading that. So his book Artificial Intelligence is actually takes a very literary and imaginative view of how we might live with machines in the future. On the other hand, Murray Shanahan's book The Technological Singularity looks in a lot of detail at how machine learning and a lot of the technology actually works. But I also really like it because it's really good at explaining how a lot of the technical detail actually gives rise to interesting ethical questions. In the middle, Cathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Mass Destruction, which is really well known, it's really sold really well, is one of the first books really bringing to the public's mind the impact of how the algorithms that are around us have on how we think about the world and what results we come to. Moral Machines by Wendell Wallach and Colin Allen, Teaching Robots Right from Wrong, is also a book I really like. Again, it's got a different perspective. It's really, really well grounded in background ethical and philosophical theory. And lastly, I put Arthur C. Clarke's 2001 A Space Odyssey just as a representative of science fiction, because one of the things you're going to need, although you need to keep down to earth in thinking about what's actually happening, because I think it's really important to look at the realities of what's actually happening around us, at the same time we need imagination. There are in fact whole courses where you can study AI ethics and computer ethics more generally via looking at science fiction. One of the things I really want to emphasise in everything that I teach in this course, one of the possible dangers of using AI is that it takes over functions that humans should really be doing themselves. So of course, One of the hopes for AI and for computing in general and for technology in general is that it helps to extend human power. But conversely, one of the dangers of that is that we use it instead of using the brains that we were born with. So one of the things I really, really want to emphasize is that what I'm trying to do is to give you the ingredients so that you can think through these issues for yourself. Because the questions that arise in relation to AI and relation to computing and to the way we communicate and respond to the world around us through computing now really has a massive impact on all of our lives. So one of the things we're going to be doing here is to consider the links between AI ethics and data ethics, because in this course I was teaching both ethics of AI and also data ethics more generally, and there are some important links between the two, although they can also be seen separately. And I want you to start to think about how and why AI gives rise to ethical questions. If you're interested in looking at these lectures, you've probably already thought of many of the ethical questions, but it's not just enough to think about what they are. We need to think about what is it about artificial intelligence that makes us realise that there are particularly important ethical questions to ask, and how do we then go about trying to understand them? So one of the things that we need to think about, one of the many things we need to think about, is to understand the importance about how machine intelligence is thought about in terms of how we generate and address the ethical questions. Because how we think of AI, what it means to us, is going to affect how we discover and understand and try to address any questions in ethics that arises. Now, there are lots of different ways of addressing these ethical or normative questions. Some are through social sciences, some are through questions like anthropology, some are through questions through religious questions or more spiritual questions. We're particularly looking, of course, through the role of philosophy. So we want to start by considering very, very briefly what the role of philosophy is in AI and data ethics, and just start to, a very gentle way, introduce some methodologies into thinking about some practical ethical questions. And again, this is just going to be a real taster, but these are the sorts of questions that I want you to be really thinking about throughout this course. And of course, one of the things also is there are really serious issues, but sometimes it gets really funny. And we also need to look at the really most high-level abstract questions about the nature of philosophy and the nature of humanity, but also in very, very concrete ways at what's actually happening. So, what's the role of philosophy in AI ethics? This potato here, Professor Potato, as I call him, you're going to see him quite a lot in the lectures, actually. Mr. Potato came out of, Mr. Potato, Professor Potato, we'll call him Professor Potato, came out of a bag of potatoes that I had during the start of lockdown in about April 2020. I discovered Mr. Potato. I pulled him out of a bag, and there he was with his little face. And he honestly did come straight out of a bag, just like this. And I'd actually at the time been on my own for quite a long time. So one of the reasons why, I just love Mr. Potato. I love his little hairstyle, actually. One of the reasons why I thought he's going to be useful for us in this course on AI ethics is because one of the things he illustrates is how easily we see faces in things, how easily we project mind and personality onto the world around us. And that's something to bear in mind when we're thinking about AI ethics. It happens a lot in how people talk about robotics, in fact, how people talk about machines in general, but we will see the human mind in the world all around us. But what's the role for philosophy in AI ethics? Well, as you can imagine, there's a lot we can say about this, but there's 4 key points that I want to make. Sometimes people talk about philosophy as if it's simply nothing other than conceptual analysis, but that's one of the things that philosophy is renowned for, and one of the things it can be useful for is thinking really, really clearly about the concepts that we're using and we're talking about, although that makes it sound simpler than it actually is. So one of the things that philosophers always want is conceptual clarification. But we need to have a word of warning about that as well, because there's no point in having bogus clarification, by which I mean there's no point in clarifying something if it simplifies it beyond an accurate representation of what's happening. Sometimes we'll come across concepts where perhaps the best thing we can say about it is that we're not really quite sure, or perhaps we can say about it is that there's a certain degree of unclarity or confusion around the edges. So that's one of the first points. one of the things we're going to look at as well is that philosophy is going to help us look at some of the key questions in ethical theory that underlies many of the practical questions in the ethics of artificial intelligence. There are questions in the foundations of ethics that we need to look at, and in particular, those are questions about how do we have moral knowledge, for example, that will come up, and questions about what it is to talk about persons. How do we understand what a human person is? And really interestingly and important, all the time we need to think about human nature, because anytime we're thinking about AI, anytime we're thinking about machines, anytime we're thinking about robots or machine intelligence, it's implicitly or sometimes explicitly a comparison with how we think about humans. There's always a comparison going along between AI, artificial intelligence, and human intelligence. And sometimes that's implicit, but it always needs to be spelt out and thought about when we're talking about ethical issues. So thirdly, what range of areas of philosophy do we need to think about? Questions about moral philosophy, questions about ethics are never simply about morality. They're never simply about ethics. There is always some underlying questions in other areas outside philosophy. But within inside philosophy, we're going to be looking at questions, for example, in the philosophy of mind, questions in epistemology or theory of knowledge, questions in metaphysics, questions in the philosophy of language are going to be coming up as well. And it's also worth bearing in mind that artificial intelligence, the development of artificial intelligence on what intelligence actually is, how we understand it, is bound up with philosophical questions right from its very beginning. And lastly, a fourth point to make, we're going to be thinking about philosophy in exploring, identifying and critiquing the methodology that we're using, the methodologies in practical ethics, the methodologies that we're using for identifying and exploring ethical issues. So one big question that I'm really concerned about, but we'll only be able to touch on in this course, is whether or not what's come to be fairly standard, if you like, working methods in practical ethics are adequate to help us understand all of the issues facing us now in AI and data ethics. So one thing I'll say now, which I might say again because I get a bit boring saying it, I've worked in various areas of practical ethics for quite a lot of my working life actually, and having for the last 5 or 6 years worked in the ethics of artificial intelligence, I'm firmly of the belief that it's the most interesting area I've ever worked in, because it's pressing us to ask really foundational questions about ethics, really foundational questions about philosophy, really foundational questions about human nature and our place in the world around us. So just hang on to your hats, because we're going to be talking about some of this in more detail throughout the course. When we're thinking about artificial intelligence and the ethical issues that it raises, we need to think about why is it that artificial intelligence ethics, the ethics of AI, is getting such special attention. We use a lot of technology that needs proper care, and a lot of technology raises ethical issues. So AI is a branch of technology, but we need to think really, really carefully about what it has in common with much of the other tech that we have. What is it that might be distinctive about AI that merits particular care in thinking about the ethics? Because, as you may well be aware, which is why you might be listening to this course, there's a great deal of concern about the ethical questions that AI might be raising. Some of these might be connected with the fact that it seems to be now developing at a very fast pace, hard to keep up with it, that it's very powerful, that it's embedded in so much of the world around us, and that it has so many different applications. Those are some of the reasons why it might be getting special attention. It might also be getting special attention because one of the things it's trying to do is to extend human agency. So we need to think about the ways in which we're trying to extend human agency and whether that's a good thing. It also might be getting special attention because one of the things that AI is promising or threatening to do is to replace human agency. So those are another reasons why it might be getting special attention. But one of the things we need to think about is, why is AI getting particular attention? What does it have in common with other questions we've looked at, and what might be unique or novel about it? So what sorts of questions does AI raise? Let's hear from Stephen Hawking.
The primitive forms of artificial intelligence we already have have proved very useful. But I think the development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. Once humans develop artificial intelligence, it would take off on its own and redesign itself at an ever-increasing rate. Humans, who are limited by slow biological evolution, couldn't compete and would be superseded.
So a lot of you have probably heard that quotation by Stephen Hawking or something similar to it before. So Hawking was talking about a set of questions that many people are concerned about regarding the future promise of the directions of AI and how it might hold particular peril for humanity. Some, as he said, consider it might be the last thing that happens to the human race. Others, conversely, look at something very similar and herald it as a great leap forward, a great progress for humanity or for the world in general. Maybe not for humanity, maybe for what happens after humanity. But at the same time, there's also a great deal of concern about perhaps more mundane, but certainly more pressing and present questions in the ethics of AI, in the AI that we're using now, in the stuff that some people say is not really AI, but we're going to be talking about it anyway, in the kind of computing, the communication, what's happening in the online world, and the use of AI in areas like medicine that's happening now. So when we're talking about AI ethics, I want to get clear on something because this is a course looking at the philosophy of AI ethics in a sense. So there's a lot of stuff that's called AI ethics that we're going to be looking at, but I think what I'd want us to do is to look at it in a way that's perhaps a bit more critically than it's sometimes talked about. There's a sense in which there's become a subject known as AI ethics, which has kind of already settled into a certain mode, a certain way of doing things. So this definition comes from the Turing Institute, the Alan Turing Institute. I'm sure you'll all know who Alan Turing is. I won't insult you by thinking that you don't know who Alan Turing is. He's going to be on banknotes in the United Kingdom any minute now. The Alan Turing Institute is in near the British Library in London, and it's a huge data institute which is doing a lot of work in data, but also looking at issues in ethics. And a lot of what they do involves actually looking at the technical aspects of trying to build ethical principles into how AI is being developed. So this is a definition which I just nicked from their website. AI ethics is a set of values, principles and techniques that employ widely accepted standards of right and wrong to guide moral conduct in the development and use of AI technologies. So I think this quotation quite neatly illustrates for me why it is that what we're doing in this lectures is not simply AI ethics, but hopefully the philosophy of AI ethics, because what I want us to do is to look at this critically, look critically at what are the widely accepted standards of right and wrong to guide moral conduct? By whom are they widely accepted? Should they be widely accepted? So these are perhaps, hopefully, slightly deeper questions, what we're going to be looking at in this course, or at any rate, that I want you to start looking at. So what I want you to do is not just do AI ethics, not to just join in, but to think critically about how we do it. And likewise, here's a quick definition of data ethics, which I found on a government website, so we're official, folks. What is data ethics? An emerging branch of applied ethics which describes the value judgments and approaches we make when generating, analysing, disseminating data, which includes sound knowledge of data protection law and other relevant legislation. So again, there are many people who have jobs where they're required to, of course, to understand data protection law and required to have an understanding of data ethics. So anybody working, for example, anybody working in research, especially research which involves data involving persons or human subjects data, has for a very, very long time known that there are very important and high ethical standards that you have to keep in order to look after that. So, but likewise, as with the definition of AI ethics, what we'd be doing in a course in philosophy would be looking and thinking critically about the underlying premises, the underlying values, the underlying justifications for any account of data ethics. And there are distinctions that can be made between AI ethics and data ethics, but there are also many areas in which they overlap. one of the reasons for that is that one of the major reasons for a lot of progress in AI, especially in recent years, is simply the access to masses and masses and masses of data that's enabled a lot of AI to progress as fast as it has. We now have shed loads of data, and the computing around us is collecting data at an unprecedented speed. We have shed loads and shed loads and shed loads of data. This slide, incidentally, is from my brother, David, is an amateur photographer. He's got this massive telescope in his back garden, and this is a slide he took. What's marked on this slide is not stars, but galaxies. So you could only imagine the amount of data in here. But the most important data in terms of ethical issues that is being collected is, of course, not data about stars, but data about people. And we've got more and more, there's data being collected about you everywhere you go, but not simply just being collected about you, but being analysed and then being used. So this is one of the reasons why questions about data ethics are really pressing at the moment, but also, as we'll see, over and over and over again, in AI and in data ethics, people stress and say, this is new, this is completely novel. It's very unlikely that there's anything in ethics which is completely new. There may be some new aspects of it and some new challenges. The speed at which things are happening may be particularly unprecedented, but there's very, very little that's actually completely new. So one of the things that I also really, really stress is that we need to look at the history of the subject, not to think that we're faced with completely novel challenges, but we can nearly always find precedents in what's been going on before. So I want us to keep a close historical note of what's going on. And actually the history can often be quite close history. So there's a lot of work going on about data in relation to AI that people started to think about not so long ago in relation to data in relation to genomics. Actually, I worked with a project with a group of genomic scientists not long before I started working on AI. A lot of the issues about the amount of data that's being collected in genomics heralded a lot of the issues that's happening in data around AI. So the claims that AI data issues are completely new is actually false. They're not completely new at all. And just as the most important, the most interesting questions about the use of data are around the use of personal data, there are many, many questions that we need to think about in terms of how we think about persons in relation to AI and in relation to data. How do we see the person? Can we represent who a person truly is? I'm just going to park this here because this is one of the things that's going to be recurring over and over and over again throughout the course. And as I mentioned before, anytime we're thinking about machines, anytime we're thinking about AI, we're implicitly at some level also thinking about the person. As well as working in ethical issues in relation to AI, I've also for a while been working with a team of medical sociologists looking at the care of people living with dementia on hospital wards. And as far apart as these topics might seem, I've found over and over again there are lots of really, really interesting overlaps in how people are seen, in how people are overlooked, in how people are humanised or dehumanised. Over and over again, the same issues crop up in how we think about AI and how we think about data. So here's a selection of some articles. I just pinched these again from Wired magazine because they illustrate a broad range of the concerns that people have about how AI relates to humanity. I picked these fairly quickly. You can find so many of these articles and so many discussions going on at the moment about how we stand in relation to technology. And of course, a slight word of warning, but over and over and over again, there's a bit of a distortion, and a lot of these things are slightly prone to sort of clickbait type headlines, but nonetheless, and also actually prone to the ways in which we kind of express our fears around AI in perhaps exaggerated or hyperinflated or slightly hysterical terms. But nonetheless, these fears do actually exist. So you can read through these, you can pause and read through these yourself, of course, but questions about what's the purpose of humanity if machines can learn ingenuity? This is a really interesting and important question about whether or not we can develop machines that can truly take over all of our human characteristics. For example, here, Google's latest experiment teaches AI to dance like a human. The person dancing there actually is a human, actually. We don't actually have machines that can dance quite like that yet, but is it just a matter of time? My favourite one here, this creepy AI will talk to loved ones when you die and preserve your digital footprint. People are developing this. By the way, if you Google AI and creepy, there's loads of stuff that comes up. People are often, there's this sort of like crepuscular sort of moment between what's really a machine and what's fully a human. This kind of like uncanny valley, as it's become known. This kind of area of kind of like, ooh, is that real? Is that a machine? Is that a human? That comes over and over and over again, and it really does raise some really deep-seated fears. Artificial intelligence could make your phone more human. Actually, that's interesting because it suggests your phone already is partly human, which is one of the reasons why I introduced Professor Potato earlier on. So how easy it is that we see humanity in what's around us. Actually, quite poignantly, we often easily overlook humanity in actual people and attribute humanity where it really doesn't belong. But does it belong in machines? That's one of the questions. Google AI chatbot threatens human master. That's really interesting use of language as well. The idea that humans are masters of machines. Should we be masters of machines? Should machines perhaps be our companions? How AI is radically changing our definition of human creativity. Well, that's quite interesting actually, because have you got a definition of human creativity? It's actually quite difficult to define what human creativity is actually. Facebook is teaching AI to understand human memes. You'll find over and over and over again these kinds of articles discussing the relationship between AI and humans. How we think about artificial intelligence is going to radically impact on how we think about the ethical issues, whether we think of it in terms of the great benefits it might produce or whether we're more worried about it, how excited we are about it, how we conceptualize it. This is from DeepMind's website. So DeepMind, as you might know, is really famous for, perhaps most famous for, having produced AlphaGo, which beat the world Go champion. What if solving one problem could unlock solutions to thousands more? Artificial intelligence could be one of humanity's most useful inventions. And this is Demis Hassabis, the founder of DeepMind, with a quotation that's often attributed to him: solve intelligence, then solve everything else, which prioritizes intelligence, whatever we mean by that, as being the key to unlocking all of our problems, as a key to unlocking everything that humanity needs to do. Now, I'm going to park that there. It's a very, very strong and very bold claim, but you'll see there are many major figures in AI who make very similar claims, and it's going to make a massive impact on how we think about AI and therefore on how we think about all the value issues in relation to AI. And in common with many, many other tech firms, as you can see, they have their own particular department for safety and ethics. It's quite interesting to look around at some tech firms and look at the kinds of things that is being said here. We want AI to benefit the world, so we must be thoughtful about how it's built and used. So a claim that we want to benefit the world. But of course we're philosophers, so one of the things we're going to be asking is, what exactly do you mean by benefit? Here's another example. OpenAI is a research institute, an AI research and deployment company based in San Francisco. Look at the mission. Our mission is to ensure that artificial general intelligence benefits all of humanity. What, of course, they mean by artificial general intelligence is the search for an AI which doesn't do something quite specific. So some AI is quite specific. You might have AI, for example, to help you read images in medical diagnosis. Artificial general intelligence would be an attempt to reproduce the general broad range of intellectual feats of intelligence that humans can do. So their mission is to ensure that it benefits all of humanity. So again, very, very broad claims of benefit, but different people are going to have different ideas about what you mean by benefit. That's going to be where a lot of the important value issues are arising. And this is another typical kind of website from a tech company, actually, which is talking about their values. Values of being trustworthy, values of privacy protection, and values of transparency. The website this comes from is the website for the company Huawei. So I'll just leave you to think about that. In fact, when we're talking about AI, technology in general, but AI in particular, we need to watch out for hype. And we also need to watch out for hype in ethics. But also in relation to ethics, hype can go both ways. It can go in the way of saying something is really fabulous, it's fine, this is great promise and progress. But it can also go in the way of actually exaggerating dangers. We need to think really, really carefully, and we need to watch out for exaggerated claims. And it's not just me that says this. We need to be really, really careful of hype in relation to AI. So let's have a little bit of a contrast to finish. We've just looked at some very strong claims about intelligence and about the value of driving our intelligence forward with artificial intelligence to solve our problems, which presses a very, very strong value on technology. So let's just remind ourselves that there are very many different attitudes around. This is from Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching. Whoever wishes to take over the world will not succeed. The world is a sacred vessel, and nothing should be done to it. Whoever tries to tamper with it will mar it. Whoever tries to grab it will lose it. So thank you very much for listening. We'll be looking at a lot of these themes in more detail in subsequent lectures. So if you want to get notifications, you know what to do. Thanks for listening, and bye-bye.